Hello, folks. Welcome back to World War II TV. And we are looking back to, well, not quite D-Day, but the Battle of Normandy and August 1944, and the command issues ahead of and during the operations south of Falaise. My guest is a senior lecturer in the Department of War Studies at the Royal Military Academy Sandhurst. I'm welcoming back to the channel now. Good evening, sir. How are you today?
Very good. Thank you. It's good to be back.
Good. So, as we were just saying there, just getting the conversation started before the viewers were here, despite its fame, despite a lot being said about the Falaise Gap, there is still more to say about it. There is still some decisions to be made about, maybe not decisions, but opinions to be formed about certain aspects of it. But before we get into your presentation, have your views over the years stayed fairly consistent, or have they kind of morphed and evolved as you've read different things and studied areas and visited the battlefield?
I think actually, after working through the primary source documentation and the better books that are out there, the better academic books on the Normandy campaign, I actually reached fairly early on a conclusion about, in particular, the command problems. And without stealing my own sandwiches of what I'm going to say later, I think actually there's probably a lot of blame to spread around, and it's not particularly productive to defend national champions in this debate. If you want to be objective about it, there is probably enough blame to spread around where mistakes were made by a lot of the Allied partners, and certainly in the high command positions.
Echoes of Market Garden. We've just had those discussions about what happened there, and it's the trying to put the blame on one single factor or one single person just seems to not really cover it. But anyway, we don't want to talk about Market Garden. We're doing Falaise. So there's your PowerPoint. So folks, what we'll do today is we'll let the professor speak, the doctor speak, and then we'll do questions at the end. I'll jump in with a couple of bits as we go along, but I'll hand over to my guest to take us to his interpretation of the command issues. So over to you, sir.
Okay, thank you very much. So as you can see, my focus is on the command problems in closing the Falaise pocket. And if I could have the next slide. And so what I want to deal with is just contextualize how we got to this point in Normandy, the end game actually. Look at the plans and the progress toward realizing plans to end the campaign in Normandy. And then very briefly placing the cork in the bottle, just indicating the deployments and some of the broad issues. I'm not actually going to get into the tactical part of the closing of the pocket, because that's actually a rather large and separate issue. And then just consider at the end, was Falaise pocket a lost opportunity? Which is, I suppose, the million-dollar question that historians have debated since really they got interested in the issue of the Falaise pocket. If I could have the next slide, please. So endgame in Normandy, that photograph is actually taken by a photographer in the 1st Polish Armored Division on one of the roads on the mace position, the Machuga in Polish, and it gives a sense of the scale of destruction that took place in this battle, which undoubtedly was quite significant. If I could have the next slide. So by the time we reached the beginning of August, German combat power was collapsing in the face of Allied strength. It's quite interesting. There's been some pieces written about the German effort, and they were only getting a fraction of replacements and supplies in, and were being steadily worn down through attrition by frankly, superior Allied strength. And between the 7th and the 21st of August, the Allied forces did have this opportunity of achieving an envelopment, a comprehensively destroying the German army. And this particular battle became known as the Battle of the Falaise pocket. Although the irony is, it probably should have been named the Battle of the Chambois or Saint Lambert-sur-Dives pocket, because Falaise was actually a little distance away from where the actual pocket was closed. Next slide, please.
We should be there. Yeah.
Right. Okay. And one of the things that has fascinated me, and certainly fascinated a lot of historians, are the historical controversies that surround this particular action. I mean, you can look at plenty of others in the Second World War, Market Garden, for example, that these particular events often generate controversies, which uh, don't necessarily illuminate what went wrong or what went right, but certainly form lively debates. And I suppose this leads to what is the fundamental question: to what extent did the Allies capitalize on this opportunity to achieve a decisive victory in Normandy? And if you accept the proposition that the Battle of the Falaise Pocket was not a success, uh, I think you really have to start with what was the role of command in this failure, particularly command at the highest levels, that is orchestrating these large scale forces seeking to destroy the German army in Normandy. And I think uh, because I'm making command of the key focus, I think it's quite important that we actually remind ourselves about the command structure as it stood at this stage of the Normandy campaign. And then, as you can see on the slide there, you've got the Allied command structure. Um, Eisenhower is, in theory, in charge of this all operation, but he is not actually going to be settled in his headquarters, um, running, essentially being the supreme Allied commander over both British and American forces in a more operational sense until his headquarters is established in France. And that's not happening until the beginning of September. And so Allied ground forces commander is Montgomery. And indeed, Montgomery had that kind of overall responsibility since D-Day. And so Montgomery is not only running his 21st Army Group, he also has, in theory, under his command, the U.S. 12th Army Group led by Omar Bradley. But we've got a bit of a problem, and please note that 12th Army Group has 21 divisions, while 21st Army Group has 16, and this is pointing to the fact that actually the American contribution in the campaign is becoming the dominant one.
Yeah.
So if I could have the next slide. So this, in fact, does lead to tensions at the top. And, at the end of the day, the three key figures who are going to decide how the Falaise Pocket battle is going to be fought in its broadest terms are these three men: Eisenhower, the supreme commander, Field Marshal Montgomery, commander of 21st Army Group, and then General Omar Bradley, the commander of 12th Army Group. Now, Eisenhower's approach is pretty light touch, and it's even lighter since he's still officially ensconced in UK rather than having his headquarters in France. And so we don't actually have a supreme commander who is giving more strategic direction at this point on how this finale of operations in Normandy is going to take place. You've got Montgomery, who has very decided views on most matters and has obviously, in his role, quite rightly, as being the operational commander on the ground in charge of both army groups, is thinking about how the campaign in Normandy will come to an end. But you've got Omar Bradley, who's acutely aware that actually the Americans now are the predominant partner in this coalition, and predominant partner even measurably in military strength. And Bradley is not particularly happy about following the directives of Montgomery. And so, frankly, at this stage of the campaign, he's just beginning to do his own thing. He's making his own decisions, not in close coordination or necessarily adherence with the thinking that Montgomery has. And so you can see you've got a combination with the three people on the top where you've got a fragmentation of the decision making, and also you don't have a clear central strategic level, operational level guidance to provide focus to how you might achieve the destruction of the German army in Normandy, particularly as it's beginning to crumble, and you can see that there's the possibility and opportunities to actually achieve this. Next slide, please. So this takes me to the plans that were generated, particularly by Montgomery, and the progress, which will highlight things that Bradley was doing on his own bat, what he thought he should do. First slide, please. This is an excerpt from Montgomery's Directive M516, dated the 4th of August, 1944. And it's not a hugely long document. I don't know, maybe 5 to 10 pages. I don't remember exactly. It's certainly not the kind of telephone directory size directives you find that armies produce these days on operation. While commendably short, the directive, it seems to me, has some significant contradictory elements. And these contradictory elements were going to be ones that didn't necessarily provide the necessary focus if you're trying to work out what the armies or Allied armies are going to do together in this end game of the Normandy operation. So you've got the task of the 1st Canadian Army, the object of the operation. And Montgomery wrote the following: to break through the enemy positions to the south and southeast of Caen, and to gain as much such ground in the direction of Falaise as would cut off enemy forces now facing 2nd Army and render their withdrawing eastward difficult, if not impossible. Generally, to destroy enemy equipment and personnel as a preliminary to a wide exploitation of success. So Montgomery is setting out a marker in his directive. He's indicating the idea that the Allied armies are really trying to make a juncture, and they're certainly moving toward each other, and that actually provides the opportunity of preventing the German army from withdrawing and hence destroying it. However, you dig deeper into this directive and you find under paragraph 13 the general note on the screen, which says the broad strategy of the Allied armies is to swing the right flank round towards Paris and to force the enemy back against the Seine, over which river all the bridges have been destroyed between Paris and the sea. Now, this is a bit curious because it suggests that the main effort is actually to pin the Germans against the Seine to destroy them. I think Montgomery's being a bit optimistic about how much of a barrier that was, because the Germans actually rather successfully were finding means of getting troops in both directions across the Seine, even if the bridges were regularly dropped or even seriously damaged. So there's a contradictory element. Is the main effort of the Allied armies to make a juncture to close the gap, or is the main effort to pin the German army against the Seine and presumably destroy them? That's rather implied in that general note. So that is one of the problems. And so this directive actually precedes some of the major operational developments by both 21st and 12th Army Group toward the end of the campaign. And we'll look at where this directive sits later on. If I can get the next slide. So this slide actually gives us a kind of visual view of the concept of operations. On one hand, you can see the 21st Army Group driving south toward the Americans having, as we will see, drive eastward to Le Mans and then make a sharp left-hand turn driving north, going to Alençon with the objective at the top end of Argentan. But you've also, you can see with the large blue arrows that if you're talking about pinning the Germans against the Seine, that is where you're going to have to move Allied armies to, where those blue arrows are. So M516, it seems to me, charitably has its ambiguities, if not actually being somewhat contradictory. Next slide, please. 1 week later, Montgomery issues another directive, M518. And here it's quite interesting that this directive rather strongly is essentially emphasizing the idea of the Allies making a junction and trapping the German armies. It says, giving a context, the bulk of the enemy forces are west of the general line Le Mans-Caen. All their supplies, petrol, etc., must come from the east, but the gap through which this must all come is narrowing. In the north, we're approaching Falaise. In the south, we're approaching Alençon. Obviously, if we can close the gap completely, we shall have put the enemy in the most awkward predicament. Now, this is, again, there's certain ambiguity of intentions here. I mean, if, instead of saying, okay, putting them in an awkward predicament, is it to make them feel uncomfortable, or is it to destroy them? Because if you're really going to drive this point home in a directive, you say that the mission is to make a juncture and thereby create conditions to destroy the German forces in Normandy. But that's not what the directive says. It's a bit more understated and implied than actually specified. So I think that's quite interesting that Montgomery is writing these rather ambiguous, vague directives at the close of the campaign.
Before we move on, it's the word if we can close the gap that stands out to me. Yeah. Not we must or we should or it's imperative that, it's if, like, well, yeah. If it doesn't rain, we'll go for a picnic. It's an odd choice as a directive for me. That's my one observation from that one is the use of the word if.
I sometimes think, after having studied these directives for a long time, that they'd be ideal candidates of how not to write a directive for staff colleges to study, for those very reasons that you identify. The if element. If I could have the next slide. So this is to set the context now in these closing stages. And sorry, I've got my slides on my screen behind me, and I'm trying to get them up so I can talk through them. The print's a bit small at the moment. So how is this envelopment, this effort to close the pocket, working? And how are things going? So the northern part of the envelopment involves basically the 2nd Canadian Corps, which possesses 2 armored divisions, the 3rd Canadian and the 1st Polish Armored Division. And you've got a series of operations taking place between the 7th and the 16th. You've got Operation Totalize, which penetrates the German positions on the road between Caen and Falaise, but doesn't actually reach a deep objective like Falaise. You then have a follow-up operation after the Corps grinds its way forward, Operation Tractable between the 14th and 16th, which begins to unhinge the German defense in the north. Indeed, one of the critical elements that does this is the 1st Polish Armored Division's lateral movement to Jor, where they capture a bridgehead. And that actually unlocks the defense and creates conditions for the armored divisions to make deep mobile operations. And then you finally narrowing of the gap between 17th and 18th, when these armored divisions begin to move south and east. And then you actually have the moment where the gap is closed between the 19th and the 21st of August. And you see a juncture between the Allied armies, particularly in the town of Chambois. Now, if you look at the southern envelopment, it tells a different story. You've got the Mortagne counterattack, which is that red arrow on the on sort of the left-hand side of the screen, going pointing west. And the Mortain counterattack, Operation Utic, between the 7th and the 9th of August, is essentially pushing Germans deeper into the pocket, indeed higher quality forces deeper into the pocket. The Americans don't really have a lot of trouble stopping this counterattack. They have a bit of dramatic moments along the way, but they're able to manage quite well. And with that failure, the Germans are deciding to get out. Indeed, the local commanders take a decision, ignoring Hitler's usual stand and fight mantra, to start getting the Germans out. The U.S. 15th Corps launches operations between the 10th and the 13th, where they're driving north, first to Alençon, and then with a further objective of Argenton, which would bring them, create a southern shoulder that will then make the distance between the two Allied armies actually comparatively short. But what is extraordinary, and this reflects not Bradley not working to a general Montgomery plan at M15, M18, but rather he does his own thing. And one of the things is, between the 13th and the 18th, he has a stop order. They don't try to get Argenton. They don't try to move beyond the point they got to the north and close the gap and reach Allied armies. So Bradley has a stop order. But more than that, in this period, you also see 15th Corps gallop off to Paris. This is Patton's Corps. It takes with it all this artillery and combat power, and they're just galloping off to Paris. Now, part of the agenda here, undoubtedly, the French Armored Division in 15 Corps was absolutely delighted, because for them, actually, it's a prestige national thing to liberate the capital. But it doesn't do anything if your objective is trying to destroy the German army. And what happens in that southern perimeter of the pocket is that as it collapses, U.S. divisions are being pinched out of the line, because you don't need so many divisions because the frontages are shrinking. And so divisions are kind of doing a shuffle to the right. And so actually, by the time you're getting closer to the point where the Allied armies actually make juncture on the 19th of August, you've got a completely different corps. You've got a completely different division. You've got the 90th Infantry Division, that is actually the division that is closest to making contact with the Allied armies coming from the north. And so you eventually get this juncture at Chambois on the 19th of August. So you've got these developments and the progress of operations, and it's quite extraordinary in some ways, because there's a real opportunity with the fighting power of 15th Corps to seal and plug the pocket more comprehensively, and of course bring even additional firepower onto range over the German pocket. Next slide, please. And it's quite interesting also, by the 17th of August, 6 days later, Montgomery issues another directive, and this is a more or less almost a phone directive directly to Second Corps, and even down to divisional level in Second Corps. And that is, Montgomery says, and it gives this direct order, it is absolutely essential that both armored divisions of 2nd Canadian Corps, i.e. the 4th Canadian Division and the 1st Polish Armored Division, close the gap between the 1st Canadian Army and the 3rd U.S. Army. And it even specifies that one Polish Armored Division must thrust on past Tron to Chambois at all costs and as quickly as possible. So all of a sudden, Montgomery is issuing pretty specific and get on with the job kind of directives. And but by the 17th of August, he's talking about making juncture with Third Army, but the key element of Third Army, 15th Corps, is well on its way on the road to Paris. So you've got this kind of change happening. Of course, the 17th of August is a day after really the Poles consolidate the bridgehead at Jor, which then becomes the so-called main supply route, MSR, for the whole Canadian Corps in terms of the axis of its advance to the east. Next slide, please. Now, the million-dollar question: why did Bradley decide to go to Paris rather than to close the gap with 21st Army Group? And Bradley's memoir does give us some kind of idea, but I don't actually think it tells the full story. And Bradley, again, in his account, in his memoirs, is underscoring that at this point he's doing his own thing. He clearly doesn't see that Montgomery is his boss. He sees Montgomery more as an equal level Army Group commander. So Bradley says in his memoirs, "I never proposed that U.S. forces close the gap from Argentan to Falaise. I was quite content with our original objective and reluctant to take on another. I much preferred a solid shoulder at Argentan to the possibility of a broken neck at Falaise. In halting Patton at Argentan, however, I did not consult with Montgomery. The decision to stop Patton was mine alone. It never went beyond my CP." So Bradley is taking full ownership of that decision to halt the armies and not actually reach juncture. In fact, it wouldn't have been at Falaise. It would have been probably Chambois or Tronde that they would have made juncture at this particular moment in time. And there we see three of the, I don't know if I should say protagonists or colleagues.
I think protagonist works in this environment.
Yeah. Okay, if I can have the next slide. And then interestingly, Bradley in his memoir goes on, "I was reluctant to chance a head-on meeting between two converging armies, for any head-on juncture becomes a dangerous and uncontrollable maneuver unless each of the advancing forces is halted by prearranged plan on a terrain objective. To have driven pell-mell into Montgomery's line of advance could have easily have resulted in a disastrous error of recognition." So basically what Montgomery is saying, I didn't want to have a nasty blue-on-blue situation where two Allied armies collide and cause unfortunate casualties on each other. Okay, and that certainly is a consideration, as probably the liaison arrangements were pretty rudimentary and would have needed to have been far more robust. And as far as a prearranged terrain objective, I'm sure they could have flown over and had a meeting with a map and say, right, we'll meet at X. So I'm don't find that so convincing. That's a minor staff officer task. It's not a major issue. So that was Bradley's story for why he didn't close the pocket, and basically implied in all this, it seemed to him perfectly reasonable to send 15 Corps to Paris under the circumstances. Next slide, please. So this brings me to the placing the cork in a bottle. And again, I'm a rather short section because I think the tactical story is worth far more time to unpack. Next slide, please. So this very busy map, and it's drawn on top a 1944 map, and it gives the laydown of where the Allied forces were, what they were trying to hold in terms of the blocking positions and so on. And also on the map, you can see I give the strengths of various formations. You can see the French Armored Division is occupying a small village with some of its elements that didn't hit the road for Paris. You've got the 90th Infantry Division having a juncture with the 1st Polish Armored Division. And indeed, the Polish Armored Division met its operational directive on the 17th from Montgomery. It reached Chambois, and at Chambois it had elements that essentially were a battle group augmented by the armored reconnaissance regiment. So you had a armored regiment, motor infantry battalion, and an armored recce regiment. These guys were pretty much cut off from their supply lines, and the Americans were to be very useful to them to keep them going with what they could supply. In the 90th Infantry Division, you actually had the 2nd Battalion of the 359th Infantry Regiment that actually occupied and met the Polish battle group. For the Poles, I think it's quite interesting. Arguably, the prize goes to Maciek for looking at the map and seeing what is actually the vital ground that has to be occupied. And that is a so-called mace position where there's effectively a large brigade group operating up there, 2 armored regiments and 3 motor infantry battalions. And Maciek, looking at the map, chooses this bit of high ground that actually is a juncture for a number of roads to get in and out of the pocket. And so if you block these roads, you're blocking a major route into the pocket and out. And then you've also got the Canadian Armored Division, and you've got a small battle group built around the Armored Reconnaissance Regiment and Division with infantry companies trying to hold Saint-Lambert-sur-Dive, where a certain Major Carey earns a well-deserved VC in his effort. And then you've got 2 infantry battalions in Tron. And then remarkably, you got the bulk of the strength of the Canadian Armored Division on the road between Tron and Vimoutiers, and they're not really doing a lot. They're just sitting up there until later on when the divisional commander, Kittens, is ordered preempt very forcefully by the corps commander to break into the Poles on the Mace and relieve them. And of course, the Canadian Armored Division commander is relieved the next day. So, but these are the tactical dispositions, and you can see it's still rather porous. All those red arrows indicate how the Germans are getting out and often getting around the areas that the blocking positions that were set up by the Allied forces. Next slide, please. Now, in a broad sense, without getting into the tactical battle, there are real issues when you're trying to close a gap. And fundamentally, the issues are, do you occupy ground, literally blocking all the exits with infantry that are supported, or do you cover the gap with firepower and inflict as much loss as possible? And certainly, firepower was available in abundance, even though there were sort of no flying areas that were set up to avoid blue on blue. The Allied Air Forces had something of a field day in a very target-rich environment. Artillery arguably was even more destructive, lethal, but certainly not decisive. There were something like 2,000 to 3,000 guns by the 19th of August that could fire into the pocket. That is a colossal amount of firepower. So there's not enough infantry to achieve density to block all routes. And also, when you're sealing a pocket like this, you've got to seal not only the force inside, but you've got to be also blocking a force trying to fight its way into the pocket to create a gap. And this is something the Germans were well practiced with a lot of experience of this sort of thing happening on the Eastern Front, where they'd get encircled and a force would fight its way into the pocket while the other force broke out at the same time. And then on top of everything else, you've got in a very confined area, if you go to the Belvoir in Saint-Lambert-sur-Dive, the Canadian sort of viewing platform, you can actually see all the positions of the 3 Allied armies, the Mace, the Americans at Bourg St. Leonard, you can see Chambois Castle, and it's a comparatively small area. But how do you achieve coordination and integration it's difficult at the highest level, but at the tactical level, it's just many magnitudes more difficult. But that again is a subject of a tactically focused story of the Falaise Pocket. Next slide, please. So this brings me to the punchline. Falaise Pocket, a lost opportunity. Was it a lost opportunity? So the next slide, please. The first voice I'll give is Ike, who actually visited, and this is from his memoirs, he actually visited the area to have a look, and he said the following: the battlefield at Falaise was unquestionably one of the greatest killing grounds of any of the war areas. And so that suggests to me that that implies a considerable success. Roads, highways, and fields were so choked with destroyed equipment and dead men and animals that passage through the area was extremely difficult. 48 hours after the closing of the gap, I was conducted through it on foot to encounter scenes that could be described only by Dante. It was literally possible to walk for hundreds of yards at a time, stepping on nothing but dead and decaying flesh. So he's actually rather painting a picture that this is a rather impressive Allied effort to achieve that level of destruction and inflict that kind of loss on the German army. But if I could pull us back, if you're the real answer to this question, if it was an opportunity, is that what is going to be your benchmark of success if you're realizing that opportunity, and that opportunity is the destruction of the German army. And J.F.C. Fuller, well-known British Army general and military intellectual, wrote, "The destruction of the 7th German Army was not the destruction of the 7th German Army and not the occupation of Paris should have been the strategical objective at the time." And I think this is fair criticism, and that obviously betrays, being a British voice, that perhaps you put more blame on Bradley than on Montgomery. But as we'll see, I'm not sure that that's particularly completely fair. Next slide. And then you've got Martin Blumensen's very interesting book, The Battle of the Generals, which I think is probably the best monograph written on the command issues in the Falaise Pocket. And his conclusion, he wrote the following: large operations of encirclement are extremely difficult to execute, but the Allies let the chance for an overwhelming victory slip through their fingers. What should have been a finely tuned and well-oiled maneuver was inept and bungled, displaying contradictory impulses. Hesitation, wrangling, and uncertainty marred the venture. The Germans themselves had foolishly put their heads into a noose, and the Allies had been unable to pull the string shut. And I think, although Blumensen's a rather well-known American military historian, the implication of what he's saying is that there's a lot of blame to be shared, to go around. And I think, as we've seen, Montgomery's directives were not particularly clear-cut. Eisenhower perhaps didn't knock some heads together to get people to cooperate. Bradley was determined to do his own thing, and was quite prepared to ignore who was nominally his boss until the beginning of September, i.e. Montgomery. And so this combination of attitudes and approaches of the senior military commanders seems to me suggests that the answer lies that blame for this failure is not due to one country or one country's leader, but in fact it has to be shared around. That probably is a view that isn't popular with any one single country, but I think the primary source evidence from this particular episode in the Normandy campaign actually rather does support this interpretation. Which brings me on to my last slide. And undoubtedly, the tally sheet was quite high in terms of losses. the Germans did lose 10,000 dead, and there were 50,000 POWs taken, which is not, which by any measure is a significant loss to the German army, on top of the high levels of attrition they experienced in Normandy. Indeed, these figures could possibly be higher. I think that the tallying is by no means particularly exact. German equipment losses were significant, nearly 350 armored fighting vehicles, nearly 2,500 motor vehicles, over 250 artillery pieces. But the statistic that is quite important is that the Germans do manage to get a lot of forces over the Seine. Now, including 40,000 troops and 28,000 vehicles. Now, not all of these 240,000 troops are going to be frontline, top line units. There's a lot of rear area sustainment logistics people that are having to be moved. But it does actually provide, give the Germans more resilience. And I think this resilience is played out later on when the Allied advance through France runs out of steam, and the Germans are managed to stop an operation like Market Garden. So significant, serious losses that unquestionably, but could it actually have been positively catastrophic? And we'll never know, a great what if of history, but it is clear that certainly command issues had its role in why this wasn't perhaps a more decisive victory in Normandy. So on that point, I'll stop for any questions and discussions.
Well, first of all, thank you very much. That was outstanding. I've got a few questions, but we'll do with some of the questions and comments from the viewers first. So the first one, and I'm going to word it slightly differently, with all due respect to Gary who asked it. And Gary is saying about the Allied lack of encirclement. Now, I'm going to word it in such a way as going back to all those meetings they were having back in, May 1944. Was there ever a discussion about the potential of an encirclement, or was it more of this idea of kind of moving in a steady line towards Germany? I mean, quite simply, was encirclement kind of a tool in the toolbox?
I don't know that it is. Undoubtedly, all the generals would have been familiar with the notion of encirclement. There's certainly no kind of doctrinal element, certainly in British or American doctrine of the time, that sees this as, that unpacks this as a major operational element. And I think Allied planning, you've got to remember that the original kind of D-Day planning was conservative in the sense that the Allies were not looking for, were looking initially to establish a very large lodgement area bordered by the Seine and the Loire, and to develop operations beyond that. And so they were thinking, and they were generally thinking in terms of bounds. And of course, the planning really for the campaign didn't go much beyond that point. I mean, their initial worries about making sure you could get a lodgment and successfully expand it and so on was more of a priority. So they didn't actually have this kind of, at least I haven't seen very much that suggests that they had any clear thinking about what follows on. And of course, when events take their course, and always events tend to surprise not only politicians but generals, they actually had to confront this issue much sooner, and certainly from a smaller geographical lodgement. And of course, this then leads to the kind of debate that follows Normandy, particularly Montgomery's idea of the strong, single, well-resourced thrust. Or do you advance the Allied in cadre, as it were, forward? And so, that's what falls out of it. So, great question. But from what I've seen, not a lot of thinking.
Well, thank you for that. My next question, and it's from the Great Dominion, but again, I'm going to add to it. And he's talking about too much preoccupation among the Allies, particularly Americans, with achieving other objectives for this to be a complete encirclement. And I was thinking about that. You know, you look at the Americans over in the West; since June they've liberated eventually, Cherbourg, Saint-Lô, then later on, Coutances, Avranches. Have they kind of got a bit excited about this idea of moving fast, gaining territory, liberating French people, and sort of racking up the area covered? Whereas maybe the British and Canadians, the East, have been looking at more of an attritional battle, because that's what ended up sort of happening in front of them. So are the Americans kind of, is it fair to say they've got a little bit interested in that covering ground aspect?
I would put it slightly differently. I think the Americans are actually being a little bit more maneuverist in their mentality. They want to get a move on, and certainly you've got characters like Patton, who that is very much part of their makeup. 21st Army Group, I don't want to use the word plodding, but they're more deliberate in their operational approach, as led by Montgomery, and it has to be said, Montgomery, and I've got a lot of time for General Montgomery, not the least because he's not trying to win the war by killing off a generation of British youth. And that means he's more deliberate, his planning's more thorough, he very much believes in using firepower. And you've got to remember that, American manpower is larger. Yeah. By the time you end the war, the Americans have many more divisions than the British and Commonwealth divisions deployed in Northwest Europe, and Britain is facing real manpower issues. You're seeing divisions being broken up, whereas the Americans are not breaking up divisions; they're actually feeding more divisions into the European theater as the campaign goes on. So, I think it's maybe too much to say that the Americans are fixated on it, but there's a different kind of approach that they have the luxury of following because they've got a hell of a lot more resources, both human and material. Whereas, Britain has to be a bit more cautious with how it uses what is now not only a finite resource, but also a resource that is actually is reducing as the war goes on.
Thank you for that. And the Great Dominion is saying again about, because the objective was never fully defined, those directives from Montgomery there are sufficiently vague that we can still interpret them in different ways 80 years later. So there can't really be a conclusive answer to whether or not it succeeds. I mean, we were talking about the seizing of the ports in Brittany. So you can see, well, the plan was to seize the ports for this reason. We can question whether or not it was a valid plan, but you can definitely measure whether it was successful because the intention is clear. But it seems we're back to this idea of there was uncertainty at the time and now about exactly what everyone was trying to do in that. Is that a fair point?
Yeah, and again, you're not really getting the top level coordination that you need for two army groups. And double hatting Montgomery, even if Bradley would have been completely Wilco and following his direction, it's not an ideal situation. So I think, all of these factors on how you set up your command structures, who's in charge, how they operate, their command styles, and then you add the sort of cross-cultural dimension of allies working together, and you can see how all of this business becomes a lot harder and more difficult.
Thank you. And Colin Taylor, my friend just around the corner in Bayer, who I was at the pub with last night, he's just saying, I think what is being proved here is that there's enough blame around to go around, and in some ways all are guilty. So
that's exactly what I was trying to say.
Yeah,
nicely put.
Well, he's Irish. He's a poet. He's good with the words, is Colin. And David is saying this was a failure from Eisenhower down, in his humble opinion. And we had that we were talking. I forget what we were talking about exactly. I think it was with Roger Cirillo. We were talking about the general directives Eisenhower was giving. Eisenhower had a habit of making his directives open to interpretation, maybe at because he was such a diplomat, he was good at keeping everybody on board. his language sometimes was a little bit ambiguous, and I think, you know, that may be a firmer hand from him telling Montgomery and Bradley what he expected of them would have made a difference.
It could have, but we don't really know. I mean, the problem is, and again, I have time for Eisenhower as well, because
Me too.
Trying to keep a coalition together is not an easy task, and inevitably there's going to be a certain amount of soft touch, soft hand on the tiller, not being too firm, because otherwise you're going to create frictions that will lead to conflicts that are actually going to damage the common effort. And you know, in this regard, you know, another, in my view, underrated coalition commander is Alexander in Italy, because he had an even bigger collection of allies to contend with, and you know, trying to keep the show on the road and keep everybody focused. It does mean sometimes you don't go for optimum military solutions, because you got to remember, in a coalition, unlike your own army, where the guiding principle is unity of command, i.e., someone's in charge and they tell everybody else what to do. In a coalition, it's unity of effort, where you have to set the general intention and goal, but you're going to have to accept that your coalition partners are going to have their own way of doing things, or perhaps modify elements of what you would like to see them do out of national considerations.
Yep, thank you. Another one, great question from Mad Cat about, do the Germans have any influence on the outcome of the Falaise pocket? Because I've read some books where they're almost written about as like sheep being herded by sheepdog, as if they're, you know, there's like the fence is getting closer and closer, and they're just all sort of running off for that gap. But you know, there are some notable stands. Anthony Tucker-Jones talks about the Germans in the Falaise Gap, for example. Are the Germans discounted in our discussions about the command on the Allied side?
I don't. I mean, there are attempts to break into the pocket, that these attacks into the Mace from outside, trying to reach the Falaise pocket, and they don't really succeed. Although to the north of the Mace position, there was a gap between the Canadians and the Poles that was really not closed until very late, after the Canadians began to move. I think, you know, it's interesting. In some ways, it's amazing that as much of the German army got out, because it quickly became the case that you're not going to get equipment out, because Allied artillery or air power is hammering anything that's moving on a road. And it quickly begins to break down into small groups under command of an officer who leads these groups out of the mess. You've got divisional headquarters staff and divisional commanders that don't really have any direct control over their formations anymore. Indeed, they may be leading a company that they've come across out of the pocket. So it becomes a rather chaotic thing. But when you get the Germans to that point of chaos and ad hocery, there is an opportunity to completely finish them off, which the Allies were, because of force density, weren't able to capitalize on the chaos and disorganization that they'd inflicted on the German army. And you know, I suppose the Germans have had to get out of a lot of encirclements in Russia, so this isn't the first time they've had to leg
Not
it.
their first rodeo, no.
No.
So a question from me this time, and I'm going to put up that map that you had earlier when we're looking at kind of the shaping of the pocket there, because there were questions in the sidebar about how much ultra was affecting things, you know, and it's more what's happening on the ground and the brilliant aerial reconnaissance. But I was thinking about that, you know, that proverb or whatever it is about the 4 blind people describing an elephant, but one touches the trunk and one touches the foot, and they all describe a different animal because they're only seeing a bit of it. Is there an element of everybody getting a different idea about what's happening? Because, you know, if you are, for example, in the Poles, you're seeing the battlefield from one point of view. If you were the 90th Division, who've been mauled up in La Haye de Puy earlier in the campaign, and they're weary there, and you've got other units that are fresh. Are they all seeing the events on the ground from very different points of view, which is helping, unfortunately, kind of muddying the water in terms of what some of these commanders are able to assess about the battlefield.
I think that's probably the case. And again, the thing about coalitions in the Second World War is that they're very stovepiped. I'll take this 300 miles of the front, and you take the 300 miles to the left, and you maybe have coalition integration occurring at the seam, but generally you try to keep everything within your own force. And so you're tending to fight your own war in proximity of each other rather than as an integrated thing. It's none of this kind of, as we've seen in modern conflicts, where you can have a Estonian platoon embedded in a British company. I mean, that would have been basically unheard of in the Second World War. And that kind of stovepiping is a real problem. And it's quite interesting. A lot of after-action reports written in the 1st Polish Armor Division, and one of the brigade reports comments on how vital liaison officers are. So if you're working with Americans, that you've got a liaison officer in their command post, and they've got one in yours, so that you don't have ambiguity about what's going on. It also has to be said that it's not, we don't, in those days, you don't have the same battlefield situational awareness that you have now in the age of satellites and drones and all sorts of Gucci sensors to tell you what's going on or give you information about what's going on. It is very much much harder to know what's going on. And of course, there's a time lag in terms of the headquarters cycle. The report that the Corps headquarters gets from a divisional headquarters is probably out of date by a number of. So achieving real-time situational awareness is difficult. I mean, this is why Montgomery had that special unit. Was it Jedburgh?
The Phantom.
That's the word I'm looking for, where he basically had liaison officers who were authorized to go anywhere, talk to
and just relay straight back. And so actually trying to know what's going on in the battlefield, particularly, this is fluid. This is all happening very fast. You've had the armies in Normandy sort of fighting, advancing comparatively slowly, and in the span of a week, everybody's driving somewhere fast. And so that fluidity does create real issues in terms of 1944 terms, in terms of understanding what's going on in the battlefield at so many levels. I'll thank you for that. I mean, I'll be down in the pocket myself with my tour group in about 2 weeks' time, and I always have to remind them that just because I'm telling people this is where the Poles were, this is where the Germans were, that the people on the ground didn't necessarily have that same information. If you're a German who's just managed to splash your way across the ford at Moissy and you're heading up that way, and I'm saying, there are elements of the 2nd Panzer Corps over there, they didn't necessarily know that. They didn't necessarily know where their fellow guys were. That's us with our information we have now, being able to show these pieces on the chessboard. And I mean, everyone had an awareness of some of the chess pieces, but no one had the awareness of all the chess pieces. And I think that's something we've almost considered when we're looking at this. So a couple more questions. Bradley Leese is asking, has the doctor read Kevin Hemel's second book on Patton? And if you have, what did you think about Patton's large encirclement plan?
I haven't read the book, so I don't feel I can comment on it. It wouldn't be fair.
I haven't got that far in the book, so I don't know. But I feel there was something Patton wrote down. I've talked to Kevin about it, about an encirclement plan that he put forward at some point, but we'll leave that for another day. Ian is making a comment. Was Monte being sensitive to the size of Bradley's arming, feeling he could give direct orders to Canadians and Polish, but not Americans? Did he feel...
I think that might have been part of the soft language and ambiguity and contradictory elements, because I think he was well aware at this point that he was going to be the 21st Army Group was going to be the junior partner before long. And but the problem is, in Montgomery had considerable talents, but being a coalition commander was not one of them.
Not one of his his main
I mean,
ones.
he usually got the backup of just about everybody, one way or the other. Even within 21st Army Group, there's this famous episode where Crerar, the Canadian Army commander, is summoned to a meeting with Montgomery, and he offers his apologies, saying that he's got this prior commitment at Dieppe, but could he come later? And so when he does meet Montgomery, Montgomery's prepared to sack him for not turning up at this meeting. And Crerar, and he asked him, what were your reasons for missing the meeting? He said, well, there were 1,000, whatever the number of Canadian troops that died at Dieppe. Those were the reasons why I wasn't here, because he obviously, as a national commander, there was a more important commemoration. Mm-hmm. And I think Montgomery was just trying to play it on to get rid of Crerar, who he didn't like and didn't rate. But Crerar called his bluff and said, well, General, if you don't have confidence in me, maybe we can take this to the government level and see what they say. And of course, Montgomery was all sweetness and light after that.
But thank you for that. But it's interesting that we've got this idea that Montgomery is the prickly one and that Bradley is this affable, the soldier's general, because Bradley could hold grudges. Bradley could be petty. He could get angry. He threw his teddy out the pram on a few occasions as well. It's interesting that we have sometimes these very kind of one sentence, simple ways of analyzing these guys that actually don't stand up to much scrutiny. And clearly Montgomery's got his issues, but it would be unfair to say that Bradley doesn't have some as well.
Yeah, and when you think about command at that level, and indeed a lot of division, even down to Army and Corps and division, unless somebody really screwed up and gets sacked, generally you're holding that command for many, many years. And we live in an age where you deploy for 6 months and then you got a completely different set of command team coming in to run the war. They were commanding for the duration, and the strain and stress of that kind of thing must have been horrendous. And it's quite interesting where you look at some very talented figures who would thought have gone a long way in the British Army, like Pip Roberts. He retires after the war, and I think it simply came down to, I've had enough of this. I want to put my
had enough of the bullshit. Yeah. I met Pip Roberts years ago.
I've lived with this for 5 years, and I don't want to live with it anymore. And so you've also got to take that into account. That none of these generals on any part of the Allied command weren't without their blemishes, even though all of them probably had enormous strengths as well. And they're human beings like everybody.
Thank you. I've got one question from me, and that's I asked a couple other historians this, is that you quite correctly stating that the British and Canadians are they're running out of manpower. They've pretty much committed all the divisions they can into Europe now. There's going to be divisions broken up over the next few weeks and months, but the Americans are still cranking things in. They haven't peaked yet, but they're going to keep putting people in. What do you think about the American concept of shuffling their corps? Where units like the 90th or the 30th get shuffled from 8th Corps to this corps, because that's not so much something the British and Canadians do, perhaps because they don't have the option of doing that. Now, Kevin Himmel, for example, who writes about Patton, he says he sees the primary American fighting unit as the division, and what corps you're attached to doesn't really matter. But I feel there are definitely issues when you get into Brest, for example, where you've got the 83rd Division in a new corps, and then you've got other. They're almost constantly shuffling their packs. Does that have an impact on how the Americans perform?
I think it's bound to. I mean, it's not only a problem, even if it's not necessarily the same level, but even in 21st Army Group, they're shuffling. Montgomery had the view, for example, that a supporting tank brigade with infantry tanks should be able to work with any division. And he moved them around quite a lot. And we do know that if you're doing combined armed operations, having good understanding and relationships between the unit commanders who are working together is vital. But if it's today one guy and the next day another, you don't achieve that. And that same is going to apply at higher levels. But there are and it's not unusual. The Corps certainly in British terms, and I think more or less in American terms, is seen as a kind of headquarter capability that will have certain assigned Corps troops, be it for artillery and so on, and engineers, and the idea is that the Corps is given the kinds and number of divisions for the task that the Corps is given in the operation, and so I think it's safe to say across the Allied coalition that kind of use of the Corps was was in the thinking, because after all, there was no Corps doctrine in the Second World War. We didn't actually get Corps doctrine until the early 1950s, and that was basically a summary of this is how it worked in the Second World War. So
that's a good answer. I mean, I'm just looking. We did a show about Britain yesterday, and the Americans use the task force concept, which isn't something the British and Canadians do particularly, where they use independent tank brigades and battalions, things like that, and kind of they create a team for the job ahead. But that's a separate subject. By the way, we've got a request to have you come back and talk about General Alexander. And his command issues. Montgomery is an interesting character to dissect, but Alexander is another interesting character to dissect. So that's a potential future one. But my last one is really going to be about this success and failure aspect, because the famous 90% successful of Operation Market Garden. Because I'm going to use sport as an analogy because I can't think of anything else. A football match is either a win, a loss, or a draw. That's it. It's a simple process. But maybe boxing can be a point system. So when you come to this Falaise gap thing, it's because, as we've said and you've established, there is no clear directive of what was actually supposed to be achieved. So we can't quite, unravel that Gordian knot. There is a lot of Germans captured and killed, a lot of equipment lost, but they get a lot out as well. So is it something you can put a score on? Do you say, well, it was a certain percentage? Do you use more of a linguistic approach to it? How do you sum it up to just kind of bring us to an end? It's clearly not a complete success, but it's also not a complete failure.
No, and I suppose when you consider the ambiguities of the directives, it actually does represent something of a significant success, particularly as there wasn't really adequate direction and guidance in setting out the objectives as perhaps they should have been if you were trying to achieve a more comprehensive result. So from that point of view, you could argue that, it was a success. But even when you look at a success, you still, it's legitimate to ask, could we have done a lot better?
Yeah.
And I think probably we could have. But again, it's going to be the great what if of histories. And I was very much cautioned in my PhD program that it's not the job of academic historians to do what if history. It's to look at
well, only in the pub. It's in the pub, but not in the classroom, I guess. But another thing to ask you in the future is whether this has what impact this has on all these relationships, because we've talked a lot in the past about Operation Torch being kind of a straining point between the British and Americans at a kind of a presidential, prime ministerial level and kind of governmental level, but they kind of iron out the command problems. And June, things are looking pretty good for the Allies in Normandy. Everyone sort of knows what the plan is, but August, clearly, even July, Cobra, tensions are starting to get there. Then later on, you get the Shelton, Walcheren, and Market Garden. Is this the first of low spots? Is it? Do they get better before they get worse? Is it a trajectory of getting worse?
I think actually the low spots occur earlier in North Africa,
right,
and certainly in Sicily. So you've got a kind of continuum of frictions in the relationship. But against this, you can look at all these different frictions, and none of them actually did serious damage to the Allied war effort.
Yeah.
And at the end of the day, the coalition hung together
Yeah.
and got the job done. And, it's easy in hindsight to say, well, that could have been better, that could have been better, and so could have been more reasonable. But they got the job done. And I think in a lot of ways, that's the great Allied achievement, is that the coalition actually worked together. And when you think about that, things like the Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force was an integrated headquarters with Americans and Brits working together. That is, significance. This is in a lot of ways new ground in war on this scale, because certainly such integration wasn't achieved on the Western Front in the First World War. And yet this actually was a hallmark of the higher headquarters in the Mediterranean, in Northwest Europe, in the course of the war. So, I sometimes think we beat ourselves up a bit too much about this and don't recognize, against the challenges of keeping a coalition together and having a successful coalition, that actually it did a pretty fair job in terms of the result.
Thank you. Yeah, agreed. I think it was Alan Allport said a few weeks ago, if there are cracks in the Allied relationship, there are canyons in the Axis that get worse and worse and worse. So this is like the Allies are having kind of minor arguments around the Christmas table over how cooked the turkey is, but the Germans aren't even meeting up anymore. The Germans they're not even coming to each other's party. I've got a weird analogy using Christmas Day, but I've done sport, I've done elephants. It would be weird to not have another analogy, but that's a very good point, that the Allies are still holding it together despite some tensions. So, well, it's been absolutely fantastic talking to you again. So thank you everybody in the sidebar for some amazing questions, and thanks for the ones that you were answering amongst yourselves there. I can't wait to invite the doctor to come back and talk to us again. But in the meantime, it's been great talking to you. Tomorrow afternoon, folks, a bit earlier, 3 o'clock UK time, we have a show about Arnhem veterans. An author has compiled a photo study of the last remaining Arnhem veterans over the last few years and what his experiences were, talking to them. That'll be quite cool. Then there's a World War I TV panel in the evening about the old lions led by donkeys myth that will be unraveled there. So keep an eye on everything there. Keep following everybody. Follow us on social media. Buy my guest books, and I will see you all again tomorrow. Cheers, everybody. Bye.
Bye.